It is with great pleasure that I present today my work to you upon the generous invitation from my dear colleagues at Ain Shams University. And I am also very privileged to be part of this seminar activity where an academic discussion is developing, where we can share our research work and have a conversation about it. So many thanks. And my presentation today is about Virginia Woolf and Maizieda. I'm going to share with you the presentation and I'm going to also share with you my ideas, my thoughts, and we're going together to listen to Virginia Woolf and Maizieda through this presentation. The first thing that I would like to highlight is the combination of the connection between the two, in the sense of both of them writing literary biographies, and both of them writing literary biographies that are not within the established canon of biography writing at that time. This is what I consider the feminist dimension in their biography writing. I'm going to start first with Virginia Woolf, and then I'm going to move on to Maizieda, and then highlight the connections between them. This is all part of my ongoing research project, which is based on some minor work that I've already done on both Virginia Woolf and Maizieda. Virginia Woolf is a British writer, born in 1882, died in 1941. She is considered a feminist essayist, a modernist, novelist, short story writer, and biographer. She was a member of the Bloomsbury group of intellectuals and the founder of Hogarth Press. And according to her, Maoni Lee, Virginia Woolf's feminist program is above all a literary one. It is inextricably bound up with her desire to revolutionize biography. And this is a very important point. It is about her contribution to biography and her revolutionizing biography. Virginia Woolf writes about biography in an article entitled The New Biography, 1927, in which she reflects on biography as a combination of truth and personality, and she sees truth as granite-like solidity and personality like a rainbow, intangible, flexible, diverse. And in that sense, she combines both and defines this in terms of biography. To her also, fiction is an important element of biography. According to her, as we see here, she explains that biography is structured along the lines of a novel. It is about character building, it's about arrangement of events, it's about dramatic effect. All of these are aspects of the novelistic genre, the novelist's art in writing biographies. Along this, we noticed that Virginia Woolf wrote several biographies, particularly women's biographies. And these were not full-length works, of course. They were more like sketches. I see them like sketches, women's biographies, Lady Winchelsea, 17th century, Duchess of Newcastle, 17th century, Dorothy Osbourne, 17th century, Aphra Behn, 17th century, and then a shift to the 18th century with Jane Austen. She wrote about Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Barrett, Browning Christina, Rossetti, Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot, Olive Schreiner, and Catherine Mansfield. She wrote about all these women. What did she write? She wrote literary biographies. Now, those literary biographies can be found scattered in several of her writings. I'm going to focus, however, on three women, pioneering writers, British writers, whom Virginia Woolf presents in A Room of One's Own. The first is Lady Winchelsea. Lady Winchelsea, for example, I thought taking down her poems. She was born in the year 1661. She was noble both by birth and by marriage. So here we have this typical introduction to her life, but it is presented in this kind of a fictionalized setting, you know, taking down her poems as though they are both characters in a kind of a situation, and then she shares with us some of those writings by Lady Winchelsea, a stanza in one of her poems. How we are all fallen, fallen by mistaken rules, and education's more than nature's fools, debarred from all empowerment of the mind, improvement of the mind, and to be dull, expected, and designed. This is an example of Lady Winchelsea's poetry, which Virginia Woolf shares with us and then comments on it. And comments in a very conversational way. How could she have helped herself, talking about the bitterness and anger that is prevalent in her writing? And then she says she must have shut herself up in a room in the country to write. So this is again part of the imagination and part of the reality because of the lack of information about women writers. She then moves on to Dorothy Osbourne, highlighting the fact that Dorothy Osbourne was considered someone who wrote nothing. She was sensitive and melancholic. This is what is known about her personality, but all she wrote were letters. And then Virginia Woolf looks at those letters, she revives those letters, she considers those letters as literature. And this is one of the things that Virginia Woolf did, challenging the canon of literary production, establishing the letters as an identifiable as a literary genre. She quotes Dorothy, one of Dorothy's letters, and then she comments on it in the way that she's capable of establishing a setting, a situation with all the details, and says, if this is the kind of writing that was produced by a woman without an education, imagine what would have been her writing had she had the opportunity to develop herself. And at the same time, she also points out that women writers who had the talent, who had the skill, believed that writing a book was ridiculous because they had internalized the position of the society. Another example, the third one, is a completely different one because it's Afra Ben. And according to Virginia Woolf, Afra Ben, the middle-class woman, has turned a very important corner on the road, of women's literary history, because as a middle-class woman, she chose writing as a career. She became a writer, she earned her living out of writing. And this was the beginning of the model that was created for women to become writers as a profession, by profession. And of course, this is at the core of Virginia Woolf's own belief in a room of one's own and an income, a steady income that would enable a woman to become a writer. At the core of her book, A Room of One's Own, is this concept. Now, having presented very briefly Virginia Woolf as a biographer of these three women, I would like to shift now to May Ziada, more or less her contemporary writer, because she was born in 1886 and died in 1941. So more or less they lived at the same time. Virginia Woolf in England, May Ziada mostly in Egypt. She was a feminist essayist, writer, and public intellectual. She was born in Nazareth to a Lebanese father and a Palestinian mother of Syrian origins. She moved to Egypt with her family in 1907-1908, pursuing self-education and writing. She was famous for her weekly Tuesday cultural salon, which went on for 20 years. And she wrote, in addition to her essays and writings and short stories and even works of translation, she wrote 3 literary biographies of Bahethat al-Badiya, of Warda al-Yaziji, and of Aisha Taimur. Now, May Ziada is considered by Egyptian critic Ulfat al-Rubi, the late Egyptian academic and Arab literature critic, Ulfat al-Rubi. She sees May Ziada as one of the critics who established what she calls women's writing on women's writing. كتابة النساء على كتابة النساء، بلاغة النساء. These are the terms used by Ulfat al-Rubi. And she tells us in her study that there are three crucial areas to women writing at the time. And of course, Ulfat al-Rubi is talking about the Arabic literary tradition. She's writing about the Arabic history, Arab literary history. And this is my translation. Women writers responded to the open call for them to write about women's issues at that time by contributing to three main areas. First, the lectures, articles, and epistles, which dealt directly with issues related to women's conditions and their liberation. Lectures, articles, and epistles. Second, literary writings, particularly in the form of the novel and short story. The third area, which is the most supportive of the liberation discourse in my mind, is what I would call a woman writing on a woman's writing, which is criticism. So here again, Ulfat al-Rubi highlights the non-traditional forms such as lectures, articles, and epistles, which reminds us of Virginia Woolf's concern with letters in the Western tradition. And at the same time, she highlights the role of women as critics. May Ziada as a literary historian, May Ziada as a literary critic, in her concern with women's writing. This, of course, is also emphasized by another Arabist scholar, Marilyn Booth, who has been studying Arab women's biographies, the tradition itself, the canon. And here she highlights the role of May Ziada in her study of Warda al-Yazigi, Aisha Taimur, and Malak Hifni Nasif, which she considers a culmination of the genre. Significantly, she chose contemporary and Arabic-speaking women as subjects, divulging a perception of collective purpose, community, and identity that transcended and respected difference of religion and origin. Now, concretely, let's see what May Ziada wrote about Bahethat al-Badi. And again, this is my translation. She starts with a brief bio note about, of course, Bahethat al-Badiya, Malak Hifni Nasif, her family, education, marriage. And then she tells us the story of their first encounter, analyzing her personality, nervousness and bitterness, and then her sharp intelligence, strong emotions, the pain that she lived in. And she describes her writing like cries, moans, roars, wails, wailing. All of this is this powerful description of Bahethat al-Badiya as a writer, using May Ziada, using the discourse of feminist criticism that takes into consideration the personal when analyzing the literary oeuvre, the work itself. In a similar way also, she looks at the work by Aisha Taimur. She explains the motives behind her study of Aisha Taimur as a pioneer in the women's awakening, as known as a poet, but still included in the canon of Arabic, not included, excluded from the canon. She was prominent not only in the context of women's writing, but also in the context of Eastern women writers. And what she said was part of the general atmosphere. So she was not saying something that was off point. And finally, she brings in this personal dimension again in her choice to write about Aisha Taimur. It's about this first encounter, not in real life, but a virtual encounter through their exposure to her writing. When moving toward al-Yazigi, May Ziada is presenting another dimension, and the discourse is different because this particular piece started off as a literary biography based on a lecture given at the Egyptian Young Women's Christian Association in Cairo, in which she analyzes the two kinds of writers. There are those who are subversive, who are not mainstream, who write beyond the established boundaries and precedes the generations in terms of awareness, intelligence, and innovation, which is probably like Malak Hifni Nasif. And then the other one that voices, echoes what her generation is presenting, like Warda al-Yazigi. Now, thinking of these two women in parallel, juxtaposing them, mixing them together, bringing them actually into a kind of conversation. What are they doing? They're both writing women's biographies. They are both using a feminist critical discourse. They are both highlighting the emotional dimension in those women's writings, in those women's lives, not only in their writings. And by doing so, in my mind, they are writing a literary her story. They are presenting a gyno-criticism in Elaine Showalter's terms. This is a literary her story. This is gyno-critics. And finally, all of this raises a question about gender and the literary canon. It raises the question about the role of women in inserting women writers within the literary canon. It is about inserting women within the literary history / her story. With this, I come to the end of my presentation, and these are some of the sources that I have been using. I am very pleased to be part of this gathering, and I am very grateful to the invitation, and I would like to end our meeting hoping for our future discussion. Thank you very much.